We have got a huge story this week, amongst everything else that is going on, because on Thursday we've got the latest ONS statistics on net migration into the United Kingdom for the year to June 2023. Now, this is important because you'll recall that record net migration figures were announced about 5 months ago for the year to December 2022. And then we were told it was exceptional. We were told they would come down. Do you remember that manifesto back in December 2019 when the Conservative government of the day, they promised in the manifesto that immigration would come down and the numbers would reduce, particularly of low-skilled immigration? Before I go to my two guests here in the studio, just take a listen to the Immigration Minister, what he said, Robert Jenrick, to the House of Commons back in May of this year.
The ONS have today amended their previous published estimate of net migration for the year ending June 2022 to 606,000. The statistics published today indicate that net migration has flatlined since then. In the year ending December 2022, they estimate that net migration remains at 606,000. These particularly high figures are in large part due to temporary and exceptional factors such as the UK's Ukraine and Hong Kong BNO schemes. Last year, more than 200,000 Ukrainians and 150,000 Hong Kong British nationals overseas made use of the routes to life or time in the United Kingdom.
So there we have the Immigration Minister, Mr. Jenrick, saying last year was exceptional. In which case, you'd sort of draw the conclusion, not unreasonably, that they might come down. He proudly said the numbers were flatlining. Really? So internal sources that have leaked news forecasts to the Daily Mail this morning says that actually it could well be 700,000 in the year to June 2023. So far from the promise from the government back in May that last year was exceptional, it looks as though actually it's exceptional in that the graph is going upwards rapidly, not downwards. So I pose my question to you, everybody. Given that this government is completely incapable of controlling immigration, the question is, will Labour control immigration any better? Email farage@gbnews.com or tweet us, #Farage on GB News. Well, I'm delighted to be joined with my two guests in the studio by Dr. Alan Mendoza, who is the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, and Scott Benton, who's the Independent MP for Blackpool South. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to come to you first, Alan. What's going on here? I mean, if these forecasts that have been leaked to the Daily Mail are correct, in the year to June 23, 700,000 net, so that's the difference between those arriving and those leaving, that's 1% of the population in 1 year. What on earth is happening?
Well, that's going to be the question, isn't it? What on earth is happening? It's interesting. We've had a big focus, haven't we, Richard, on illegal migration over the past few years, the small boats, etc., and ignoring the fact that there's a much bigger legal migration issue. Now, I say it's an issue. It depends on, you've got to slice the cake and work out what's going on here. I think, there was in the past the Ukraine case, the Hong Kong case, the Afghan case. There were cases that explained this, but those are petering out now. So what's explaining this massive jump in numbers, if this is indeed correct? And we need to know whether these are temporary student things, if they're work permits being issued, is it an attempt to get cheap labour in, is it an attempt to bring people in past the world? What is it?
Well, we know that work visas are up 45%, right. OK? We know also that existing foreign workers have extended visas significantly. You've touched on a really significant point, which is student numbers. Because these numbers only include a percentage, it seems, of the overall student visas, which for the year, I think, to June 23, was some 650,000, compared to 4 or 5 years ago, it was just 200,000. And many of those are not included. So, I mean, this is more than a surge. It's like a torrent.
Yes, it is a torrent, and I think what's interesting with this is, if you're looking at people who are here for the foreseeable future, what is the integration strategy for these people to come into this country? Because, one person, if there's no integration strategy is a problem. If it's 1.3 million, you've got a huge situation on your hands.
Absolutely right. Well, let's turn now to Scott. Thank you for being with us. What's the impact? I mean, you're an MP. You stood in the last election on the basis of reducing immigration, particularly low-skilled immigration. What's the impact on your constituents, and how do you think they will react if these forecasts prove to be right on Thursday?
Well, when the British public are asked, time and time again, they want to see net migration figures reduced. And I'm afraid over the last 25 years, we've seen exponential growth in immigration, firstly under Tony Blair and the Labour government, and since then the Conservative government. You mentioned the manifesto I stood on, Richard, which pledged to reduce net migration numbers. And despite that, we are seeing probably 2 successive years of immigration, net immigration, in excess of 600,000. That is not what the British people want, and they expect us as a government to drive down those figures. That is not happening. My constituents will rightly be absolutely furious. And
because the number when the last general election was, the net number was about 250 to 300,000, as I recall. So you're looking at well over a doubling and rising 4 years later.
Absolutely, and the media often focus upon the illegal immigration problem. It's a legal migration part which is putting such a huge pressure on public services, on housing in this country. For example, my constituents can't find an NHS dentist. They have huge problems finding social housing, public services are under immense pressure, and yet we are seeing these record migration figures year upon year.
I mean, these, of course, one follows the other. Frankly, as night follows day. It's pretty obvious. If you increase your population by 10 million in 20 years, then you need to grow all of your public services accordingly. If you're increasing your population net by 1% in 1 year, that's 10% in 10 years at this rate. The reality is that the government's completely misled us. I mean, some would say because some of this is deliberate. They set the threshold for their supposed skilled worker visa so low that essentially it was open borders.
I absolutely agree. And don't forget, in 2016, the majority of people who voted to leave the EU did so because of immigration. So people voted in the EU referendum. They've returned 2 successive Conservative governments since then with a pledge to drive down net migration, and that hasn't happened. And people will rightly be incredibly upset and asking questions about why the government aren't driving down these figures, and they are increasing year upon year.
So there's another point to this, Alan, which is that the ONS, in their infinite wisdom, they keep revising the method of calculating the numbers. And they did it 6 months ago, and I think they've announced that in 2 days' time they're going to revise the numbers again and also look back. I mean, the slightly cynic in me says that they might be cooking the books. Am I being completely unfair?
Well, they might be cooking the books the other way, actually, ironically, and including more people in figures that should have been included many years ago. Maybe we always had a bigger problem than we actually realised. There is that potential. Unless you know what the actual mechanism is that they're looking at, it's difficult to make that prediction.
So I suppose, looking at it from the other side of the debate, many will say, economists, possibly some from part of the Conservative Party, that actually lawful immigration is a good thing. It grows the size of the economy and brings in more people to fill jobs. We've got a labour shortage. So that's their line of argument. What's your answer to that, given all the pressures we're seeing?
Well, that's an argument, and this is why it is such a nuanced issue, because of course you've got this point. If you're bringing in people who are going to do jobs, they're going to pay tax as well. There is that sort of side there, and you're looking, therefore, at potentially growing the economy. But the flip side is what Scott was saying, the infrastructure question. You can't just bring this amount of people into the country, even if they pay tax, without the infrastructure to support them. And you also can't do it if you don't have an integration strategy to essentially say, right, you're in the UK, British values time, you're British citizens, or you're going to become, not British citizens, but you're going to become part of this society. You're going to be part of it. And we've seen, haven't we, in the last few weeks, the implications of that. If you don't have that, you have people on your streets disrespecting our war memorials, etc., and things like that happening.
Absolutely right. So, Scott, we may hear in the autumn statement from Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, tomorrow, a reference to what they call the starting point at which people can come with skilled worker visas. I touched that it was down at about 26,000. They're talking about increasing it maybe to £30,000 a year. Do you think that's enough? Do you think that will make any change? The government might say, well, actually, this is going to cure the issue. What do you say to that? Or would you like to see the threshold much, much higher?
I think there's a number of things, Richard, the government has to do at the moment. Not just stop the boats and the illegal immigration aspect, but also putting a cap on the number of refugees which come here every year, closing down some of the student loophole routes, which, for example, means somebody can graduate and for 2 years afterwards they can stay in this country without a job. We need to look at that. And as you've said as well, we need to raise the salary threshold. I would say that needs to be above £40,000. Encouraging noises coming out from Robert Jenrick, but I would say it's not enough and he has to go further if this government is serious about driving down net migration, which is what my constituents expect to see.
Well, you see it in your postbag, I'm absolutely sure. Gentlemen, thank you so much indeed. 2 days to go before that number is released.